Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is November 24th, 2021. And Helga, we've launched a series of initiatives coming off our conference on November 13th and 14th, which are aimed at addressing some of the most important crisis points and giving people an opportunity to join us in our mobilization. So maybe we should start with that. On the strategic side of things, you participated along with several other people in a conference in Yemen yesterday, which sounds quite interesting, sponsored by the Belt and Road Committee there. Why don't you tell us what happened there?
Well, this is actually a joyful event because yesterday they celebrated the first BRICS Day, and that refers to the BRICS Youth Parliament in Yemen. This is a group of young people who, despite the fact that the country suffers from war, and actually while this conference was going on, there were new bombing attacks from Saudi Arabia on Sana'a. So under quite dangerous conditions, nevertheless, they had a very optimistic event celebrating essentially the perspective of Yemen hopefully becoming part of the new Silk Road. And this was an event which was basically chaired with from the Prime Minister bin Habtour and the foreign minister and the cultural minister. So, and then naturally a high ranking delegation from other government officials, but also very high level representatives from Russia, from China, from India. And basically, they published a new book which has a lot of reference to an economic reconstruction program which we developed in the Schiller Institute some years ago, and also some of the economic theories of my husband, Lyndon LaRouche. And they had, in the middle of this war, uh, courses on physical economy, based on the theories of Lyndon LaRouche. So this is very, very important, and, in a certain sense, this is an example of a country, which is obviously one of the poorest in the world, which have an incredible COVID crisis. We know from the video which was made by David Beasley, Hunger Ward, that there is an incredible starvation problem. But nevertheless, these courageous people, have a very optimistic perspective of building a better future. So this was very nice, and I had a video address there together with Jacques Cheminade from France, Hussein Askari, Marsha and Doug Maluk, our very good members from the United States, Diane Sayre. So this was very well received, and this establishes one more important step in the collaboration we have with these people. I mean, people know very little about Yemen, but Yemen has a very proud history. It was once a very important pearl in the necklace of the old Silk Road, and it has a very high cultural tradition, with the perspective now that this is all being revived and the country is being rebuilt. So I think this was, despite the horrible circumstances, it shows you that if people have a good plan and have a vision for the future, that you can start building, even under conditions of war and tyranny, build a better future.
Well, and that perspective is the one that you're also bringing to Afghanistan with Operation Ibn Sina, where the situation is worsening. And so far, the transatlantic countries are ignoring it. There's the depraved indifference as people are dying. What do you have on the situation there now?
Well, I think it's worse than depraved indifference. I mean, that goes for the majority of the people who don't care, and who have forgotten that NATO was for 20 years in Afghanistan and only left in August, leaving the country essentially as a rubble field. But there is a new statement from a representative of the U.S. State Department. I think his name is West, and he was very bellicose. He said not 1 cent will go to the Taliban until they have completely reformed, ignoring the fact that the Taliban is under very difficult circumstances trying to get certain basic economic functions going with a population which is 93% in danger of starving. That is a report from the UN and from the World Food Program, that more than 90% of the people are food insecure, have no access to medical supplies, and only Russia started to ship in by plane some humanitarian aid. Also, China has started to send in, I think, 100 tons of cotton for, because it's also freezing. The winter has arrived, which is normally very terribly cold in Afghanistan. So the situation is absolutely horrible, and it looks really like that certain forces in the West, in the United States, in the UK, supported by the EU and European nations, that they are pushing a hard line against the Taliban government, which means, I mean, they're not caring at all for the lives of officially 23 million Afghani people. I find this, I do not want to hear moral values and values of the West anymore, because as long as such a behavior is being demonstrated, the West is morally not only bankrupt but guilty. Now, the situation, if you push the Taliban into drug production because they have absolutely no other access to any money, then that is not the fault of the Taliban. It's the fault of the people who keep the money frozen, which belongs to the Afghan people, in the US Treasury, in Commerzbank, in Bundesbank, Bank for International Settlement. And this is a real crime. Now, I have, since we are concerned with what happens with Afghanistan, which is geographically in the middle of what has been the ancient Silk Road and what is now becoming the new Silk Road. We have been concerned with that for a very long time, and more recently, I said, we have to name this the Operation Ibn Sina, because if you want to have a modern health system in Afghanistan, which under times of a pandemic is absolutely crucial, if you want to prevent mass death through the pandemic, hunger and freezing. And I've called this Operation Ibn Sina, according to this universal sage who was one of the greatest doctors in all of the history of mankind. In the West, he's also known as Avicenna, and he lived from 980 to 1038. He wrote many books on medicine. He made huge breakthroughs. He was sort of a wunderkind. But he, developed a book about the anatomy of the body, of the relationship between the muscles and the nerves, herbal medicines. In any case, he is one of the maybe the most famous doctor, together with people like Galen or Hippocrates, who have shaped what now is known to be modern medicine. And given the fact that the effort is to try to defeat the pandemic and build a modern health system in Afghanistan, I thought that the name of that person, who at least his father is for sure born in Afghanistan. There are some different sources which give different places where he may have been born, but in any case, he comes from this cultural region, and to give the effort to save Afghanistan his name. Now, that is an idea which started to catch on. I'm quite pleased. Just appeared a major article by me in a Chinese scientific magazine talking about the Ibn Sina project, but also in Italy, the leading Italian trade unionist, Mrs. Ruggiero from Sicily, she gave a press conference about it, endorsing the proposal with her trade union and this was published in Corriere di Sicilia, and it will be published in several more regional papers, so that the idea is gaining more and more support. And then naturally, we had several webcasts, web seminars we participated in. I participated in several in Pakistan, in the United States, and there also the idea of Operation Ibn Sina is gaining momentum. And I would urge all of you who are watching this program that if you have any concern for what is the suffering of the Afghani people who have gone through 40 years of war, and now the West is just moving away, leaving the country, basically to die. Whoever does not agree with that should join our efforts and help to build this Operation Ibn Sina, which is really a very, very important cause.
And there's more information on that on the schillerinstitute.com website, including a segment from the most recent conference. Now, also on the website, we have posted something which I think is quite significant, a letter from the former Surgeon General of the United States, Joycelyn Elders, calling on medical professionals to launch an education campaign on the pandemic. This is crucial because of all the different narratives and disinformation coming out there. What is it that Dr. Elders called for?
Well, basically what she addresses is the situation that, you have a fourth wave in Germany, a fourth outbreak of COVID, a fifth wave in France, a lockdown in Austria. And, you can continue the list. In the United States, the figures are going up again. And this is all, causing quite despair. Many people are, we already have more than 5 million people who died. In Germany, we will probably this week have 100,000 person losing their life. That is a lot of suffering and a lot of death coming from that. And, still, it seems that the pandemic is absolutely nowhere under control. You have a small portion, or not so small in some places, 1/3 of the population being anti-vaxxers for one reason or another. And, there is a general frustration in the population. And, if you look at it, it's now almost 2 years that we have this pandemic. And, if you look at the German government, for example, they made so many mistakes. First, there were no masks. Then, they had this and that, and changing the rules back and forth. So the population is in a state of mistrust against the government. The confidence that these governments are capable of dealing with it, is shrinking. But, if you look at the process as a whole, it is very clear. One thing is absolutely missing, at least in the transatlantic world. Maybe it's different in China for sure, because with a population of 1.4 billion people, they have so far less than 5,000 people dead as compared to 750,000 in the United States. So, the West is obviously not capable of coordinating their activity. And what is glaringly lacking is that the population gets clearly educated what is a pandemic, because there is a very big difference between a normal disease, an epidemic, or a pandemic. And the pandemic, there are strict rules you have to follow in terms of sanitation, in terms of, medical conduct. And if you don't do that, the pandemic tends to go somewhere else, come back, mutate, like we see it now with the COVID Delta variants. And there's still no guarantee that not new variants will come, because unless you have a modern health system in every country, in the least country, in Africa, in Latin America, these waves come back, and you don't get it under control. So what this letter is supposed to do, it's supposed to address the absolute urgent need to have a thorough education campaign. What is a pandemic? What does medical science know? What are the basic rules? What you do in the case of a pandemic? And then simply, educate people. And she is calling on medical professionals, retired and still active, to join with her internationally to do that, because obviously the governments were not capable or not interested or not, who knows what reason they had, but that kind of an education has not taken place, and therefore a lot of spins are being circulating. People make all kinds of constructs. I mean, we have been accused that we sold out to Bill Gates because we say that there is a pandemic, which is obviously ridiculous. But I think that the basic education, scientific education, what is the basic rule, which needs to be followed, that has not been communicated clearly. So maybe some educated parts of the population know, and that such an education is not necessary. But there are some people who are not watching the mainstream TV or read the mainstream newspaper because they have turned away from all of this for one or another reason. So the information which was available has not even reached them, and that has to be remedied, because I'm afraid that this thing gets worse and worse, because it's not just the pandemic, which is clearly out of control. It's also inflation out of control, energy prices, food prices, and we will go into a winter of discontent, where there is nothing in sight yet coming from any of these governments to counter that in any efficient way. So I think we are in a very dangerous situation from the standpoint of the social cohesion of our societies. And I think this initiative is calling on medical professionals to join hands and to educate the population, at least about that aspect of the pandemics.
Well, if you want to have an interesting Thanksgiving dinner, I would recommend that people download her letter, which is up on the schillerinstitute.com website, and discuss that over Thanksgiving dinner with your family. Because this is the kind of educational public information campaign that's been lacking, which is why there's so much confusion and disorientation. Now, speaking of confusion, we have an escalation around the situation with Russia and Ukraine coming from the usual suspects, the British and the US military industrial complex, claiming that an invasion is imminent by the end of January or February. Russian troops are going to overrun Ukraine. This is the same old story, but it's very dangerous right now, isn't it?
Yes, it is very dangerous, especially because there is this maneuver taking place right now called Global Thunder, and the defense ministers of Russia and China, Wei Fenghe and Sergei Shoigu, they both said that they regard this what is happening in this maneuver as a basic security threat both to Russia and China, because US bombers, nuclear capable bombers, flew their maneuvers along the Russian border up to 15 miles distant. Now, 15 miles, I mean, if you think how fast these bombers are flying, 15 miles is like, I don't know, I haven't calculated it, but it's really an extremely short time until you could have a violation of the airspace, and an accident could be triggered or some uncontrollable situation could develop. So I think we are sitting on a complete powder keg. The US Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, went to Brussels, and she briefed the NATO ambassadors about this supposed pending attack by Russia on the Donbass, which I think is completely ludicrous. But if there would be any attempt by the Kiev government to move militarily on these Donbass and Lugansk, then this would have very, very disastrous consequences. This was a warning by Andrei Kortunov from the Russian International Affairs Council, who basically warned that this is threatening to destroy the defense symmetry and could really lead to disastrous consequences in the short term. So I think this is absolutely incredible because I mean this could lead to war in a short period of time in Europe, and I think people should absolutely take a step back. Europe should absolutely denounce that and not be part of it.
Now, at the same time, we're seeing an escalation again in the Taiwan Strait. A U.S. Naval vessel went through. That's not completely unusual, except that it's occurring under a condition of heightened tension. What's the latest you have on the China-Taiwan situation?
Well, one always has the hope when something comes from the Biden administration, thinking that they are making steps to cool the situation, which, in a certain sense happened because Biden had a 3.5 hour long virtual summit with Xi Jinping. And one would have hoped that this would lead to a normalization of the situation. But then you have this, that again, US warships just going through the Strait of Taiwan, being followed by PLA ships. So this is really not designed to calm the situation down. There is now new talk about a possible summit between Biden and Putin. The Russian side said that it needs to be prepared very carefully because the agenda is huge. But then you have these provocations. So it's always like mixed signals. One gets the feeling that this is all intentionally, to always increase the tension, to never let the other side rest, take off let the guards down. And, this is the climate in which accidents and, in the worst case, wars can happen. So I think this is really very bad. And I think it's high time that the European countries really take a step back, but they don't. Unfortunately, there are all the signs that they are just the poodles of this warmonger faction.
Well, and the threat of war is often a useful diversion for the oligarchy if, in fact, they're facing a whole series of problems, such as the collapse of the COP26 conference, the inflation, the acceleration of the COVID pandemic. And look, the inflation situation is out of control. Biden renominated Jerome Powell, who has no clue of what to do with it. Obviously, the solution is the LaRouche solution. So what do we do to get this fight out into the open?
Well, I think the line coming from the Fed a couple of months ago that this will be a, quote, temporary inflation, which was a joke from the beginning, because or hyperinflation, because once you are in the domain of hyperinflation, there's actually nothing you can do because, you are dealing with a collapse of the physical production. And, the Fed right now and the central banks are in a position where they start the tapering, the slow increase of the interest rate to fight the inflation. The risk of a chain reaction collapse is imminent, therefore they are afraid to do it. And then on the other side, you never know if the intention is not to have a hyperinflation because the system is so completely indebted. So how do you get rid of the debt? There are only two ways. One is what LaRouche says, namely you have to completely write it off with a Glass Steagall procedure, distinguish between legitimate debt and illegitimate debt, or you hyperinflation the debt until it's gone because, it becomes ridiculous. If you have $1 billion debt and, the inflation rate is low, then $1 billion is a lot. But if you have a extremely high hyperinflation, $1 billion may be nothing by tomorrow. So, that should never be gotten out of the mind entirely. And you still have this great reset, shifting the trillions, where they want to avoid, shifting into the green investment, going out of energy with, coal related or fossil fuel related energy sources energy sources and production. Now, this is designed to collapse, and I can only say that if there is not very quickly building an alliance of forces internationally to say we need a global Glass Steagall, we need to get rid of this speculation and casino economy, and we have to go to national banking in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton or the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in the post-war period in Germany. That is the only road to go, and an international alliance must be built, because otherwise, if you have hyperinflation in food, and the FAO just published a new report that the annual inflation in food prices was a whopping 31.3%. Now, remember that many governments fell in the past because of food riots in the streets. And this is not out of the question, because, if you have a lot of money, a little bit more price for the higher price for your bread, you don't notice. But if you live on $1 a day, which is the case for many billions of people in the world, then, that may just tip the thing over the edge. And, so we are sitting on a complete powder keg. So we must renew the discussion about Glass Steagall and national banking and the new Bretton Woods credit system to replace this absolute bankrupt transatlantic system.
Now, in the midst of all these crises, we have a situation here in Germany, which in a certain sense would be almost a comic farce if it weren't so tragic, namely what this new coalition government that's being formed now is shaping up to be. What can you tell us about this?
Well, the image which comes to mind is this painting by, I think it's an etching by Goya. When reason sleeps, it gives birth to monsters. Now, the sleeping reason was the 16 years of sleep of Merkel, because she did almost nothing except exit from nuclear energy, which she will become infamous in history for having caused whatever came in terms of the effects for the German economy out of. But otherwise, it was her policy to not allow anything major, no major initiative, no vision. So it was a sleep of reason for 16 years, but that gave birth to these monsters. The idea that this cabinet, which is going to be announced today, or at least the coalition treaty will be announced today, maybe the posts a little bit later. But what is in discussion right now is Lindner from the FDP as finance minister. He is for the Great Reset. Then you have probably Habeck as the economic minister, added to that the climate ministry being part of the economic ministry. Now you can imagine all the decisions and all the legislations will go in the direction of green, which will be the death knell for the German economy. And then to crown it all, well, Scholz naturally will be probably the chancellor, very, very likely, also a man of the Great Reset. But then you will have this NATO mouthpiece, Annalena Baerbock, to be the likely foreign minister. Now, she came out with tough line against Russia and China. I mean, Habeck went to Ukraine and he was seen in NATO camouflage, talking about delivery of heavy weaponry to the Ukraine. I mean, this is not foreboding well for Germany. And I can only say, people have to wake up and start to fight for a different policy, and that can only be peaceful cooperation with Russia and China, the development of the developing countries, Africa, Southwest Asia, together with the Belt and Road Initiative of China. So the alternatives are there. but we definitely need a population which is really getting active, because otherwise I foresee a terrible development for Germany in the near future. But I think people always have a certain amount of fault for the government they have, so there should be a great rethinking as the conditions become really bad. And fortunately, there is an alternative. I would say the very first step is work with us on such things as this education campaign around the pandemic, the Operation Ibn Sina to save Afghanistan and Haiti for that matter. And I could mention Syria and Yemen because they are in a not very different situation. So there is a lot people can do. And I am calling on you to get active with us.
And the starting point for that is go to the schillerinstitute.com, where we've been posting these videos, as I mentioned earlier, from the most recent conference, as well as on these committees that you've called for to be established. And there's plenty of room for people to join and work with us. And if you have an interest in this, if you have an interest in saving humanity, take this opportunity before it's too late. So Helga, thank you for joining us today, and all things going well, we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.